about what we've defined as kind of anti-ISIS foreign fighters that travelled to Iraq and Syria primarily between sort of 2014 and 2016. So I'll just do a brief introduction to sort of who we're talking about as part of this group, and then some of their travel, funding and support networks and what they got up to while they were out there. So just to start off, we've sort of used anti-ISIS foreign fighters, but it's a bit of a catch-all term. We also included people who are fighting against other extremist Islamist groups, such as Jabhat al-Nusra at the time. But we kind of decided to go for anti-ISIS foreign fighters, partly because, as we'll see in a second, a lot of the motivation was sort of sparked by media coverage of ISIS in particular, rather than other extremist Islamist groups. This research was based on a data set of 300 fighters compiled from open source information at the time, primarily social media accounts. And the research was conducted in English, French and German, but also complemented by some support from Italian, Spanish, Turkish and Kurdish speakers. There are a few kind of caveats to the data set. Obviously, as it was open source, we think it is probably skewed towards those that were happier to have public profiles or to talk about the activities that they were involved in. So, you know, I think that certainly has an effect on kind of the overall impression that this particular set gave us, and may not be representative of kind of the entire group of fighters that travelled and those that were perhaps a bit more careful or secretive. In terms of who was in this group of 300, almost half of them were in their 20s, but we had the youngest was 14, who travelled with their parents or parent, and the oldest was 67. And in terms of gender, compared to those joining extreme Islamist groups, where estimates for women and girls range between 14 and 18%, sorry, we only found 3% of those in our data set that were female, and primarily they were all joining the YPJ. In terms of ethnicity and religion, we weren't able to find information for this category for a lot of fighters, but for those that we did, by far the largest two groups, unsurprisingly, were Kurdish, and then a small number of Assyrians and Yazidis as well. In terms of nationalities, again, this is potentially skewed by the languages that we had access to from a research perspective. But I think overall we felt that this was fairly representative of those that we could see online and that were talking about their activities publicly. So as you can see, over a third of them were American, and then the next biggest proportion were British and Western Europeans, with kind of Canada and Australia up there as well. But there is, as you'll see on the graph, quite a long tail of sort of unexpected nationalities, ranging from other European states, but also China, Hungary, Indonesia, South Korea, and a few others as well. So overall, a very diverse group in nationality terms. In terms of education and employment, we found that, again, not a huge number of them sort of provided, or there was publicly available information on this, but we found around half of them had completed secondary, and then half of those that we were able to identify had completed secondary, half undergraduate, and then just a single person with a postgraduate degree. What was interesting, though, that those that had studied at tertiary education level, a huge number of those studied kind of political or international relations related courses. So had a previous kind of interest in international relations, potentially political violence, prior to their involvement in the conflict. And again, employment data was also harder to find, but we were able to kind of discern that the majority of them were skilled workers or professionals, and then a much smaller number unskilled or students. And then probably by far the biggest category that we found was that almost a third of them were happy to share details of their previous involvement with their national militaries. And so we think that explains the large proportion of Americans and British fighters that had previous military experience in the region. In terms of the groups that they joined, again, we were able to identify around 2/3 of the 300 and the groups that they joined. So YPG and the Peshmerga were by far the biggest proportion, and then a smaller number were joining other Assyrian or Christian groups, the YPJ, and then a few that were joining groups like Hezbollah or the FSA, or specifically the PKK rather than the YPG or the YPJ. I won't go too much into detail on motivations, but overall, obviously the kind of ideological drive of this group was sort of diametrically opposed to extreme Islamist groups and those traveling to join those. But what we did find was that sort of beneath that, a large number of the kind of the push and pull factors that we observed through some of their statements and interviews were actually remarkably similar to what you'd find, I think, across conflicts and across different ideological groups. So as I said, sort of a lot of them had an interest in foreign policy and were frustrated by the lack of international response to the conflict, or at least the lack of success by sort of early international interventions. And again, a factor that's common across, I think, all of these different areas and conflicts was a kind of desire for belonging and purpose in their lives. And then in terms of pull factors, yeah, defending persecuted minority populations was one that came up very often, especially obviously those with ethnic ties to the region. For the military veterans, I think that was a very strong driver, that they'd obviously had previous experiences in Iraq, sort of in the preceding decade or so, and they felt that kind of the progress that they felt they'd made while they were out there was being undermined or destroyed, and they didn't want to see kind of colleagues who had been injured or lost their lives efforts sort of go to waste. And then finally, again, a common one, a sort of urge to fight, experience combat, or purely sort of to solve boredom in some cases, or for sort of, you know, there was accusations even that some were kind of taking it as a gap year. So in terms of travel, and this came up in the previous presentation, but at the time, there was certainly a very ambiguous legal situation for anti-ISIS foreign fighters. Obviously, this varied depending on the countries that they were coming from. But overall, sort of the broader picture was that there was far less enforcement and far less monitoring of this group. And as a result, they had more travel options. There was less scrutiny of their plans. And they were fairly open about these, actually, especially earlier on. This did start to change a little bit once a few of them got sort of arrested at airports on their return. But overall, we found that they were able to make fairly solid plans and sort of plan in advance and coordinate in advance with people on the ground. They also, because of this, I think, were able to, or had much more certainty in terms of knowing which groups they were going to join up with. And I'll come back to this in a second. But obviously that differs from kind of stories you hear about people crossing the Turkey-Syria border, and sort of, you know, it potentially depending on who they get picked up by at the time. The primary route we found was through Sulaymaniyah in Iraqi Kurdistan, and a lot of people from Western Europe traveled to Turkey first and then flew onto there. Others had gone via sort of other hubs in Europe or potentially the Gulf, but that seemed to be the sort of primary thoroughfare there. And as you can see in the picture below, that's the airport. And we did come across kind of, you know, social media posts of people, you know, essentially live tweeting their journeys. So in terms of funding and support, I think in terms of funding, we didn't find sort of financial incentives to be a particularly big driver, or really any evidence of them being paid. The vast majority, again, as far as we could tell, was self-funded, often through sort of savings, or you know, they'd saved up and quit their jobs, and also others that had sort of backgrounds in the private military or security sector, who we actually could find less information on. I think they tended to be more careful about sort of what they shared, but we weren't necessarily able to tell whether, for example, some that were kind of offering training or almost kind of induction courses for anti-ISIS fighters, we couldn't really tell if they were doing that for profit or not. Finally, the only kind of exception seemed to be ethnically Kurdish fighters who were joining, particularly the Peshmerga once in the region. And obviously, as the Peshmerga was a kind of much more formal and organized force, you know, I'm not sure they were necessarily getting paid, but they also weren't necessarily self-funding. They were kind of being supported through that infrastructure on the ground. We also did find plenty of evidence of crowdfunding. And I think sort of that period of 2014, 2015 was certainly in an era of kind of social media and online platforms before sort of a lot of them thought seriously about enforcement, even though obviously they might not be fundraising for technically illegal activities. I think now, you know, this type of fundraising campaign would certainly be against those companies' terms of service. But the primary ones that we came across were sites like Indiegogo, GoFundMe, Fundraiser, so fairly mainstream fundraising platforms. You were able to observe people making donations to these crowdfunders, but often they didn't reach their targets, and to some extent we felt that they acted as a form of propaganda in terms of kind of making the case for why they were there, sort of making an appeal on behalf of the local populations. And we did also see accusations flying around of fraudulent campaigns, and that was something that we heard in the previous presentation, and I'm sure almost certainly went on for the anti-ISIS fighters as well. And at times you would see kind of fundraisers being shared, but for the purpose of calling them out as fake, rather than trying to support them. But I think overall what we found in terms of kind of networks and support was that fundamentally Facebook was the primary network, or the primary sort of networking tool for this group. At the time, there were a lot of fighters being very open on Facebook, and I'll come to some of the Facebook groups where they tended to congregate in a second. But here, just quickly, 2 examples of crowdfunders from 2 of the different sites I mentioned. So slightly different, one that has a little bit more of a focus on kind of defending the local population, and the other that's a little bit more kind of personally requesting support. So as I said, in terms of online networks, we did find a huge amount of sort of anti-ISIS fighter presence on Facebook across a number of different groups. And they use these for a variety of different purposes. So networking, fundraising, merchandising, and you could buy sort of, t-shirts and hats and things like that. But also facilitating travel. So, again, sort of at the time, and maybe this was cracked down on sooner, but similar to ISIS fighters, we found a lot of them sort of live blogging, live tweeting their experiences, sharing very individual posts about what they've been up to, and then that proving a sort of anchor for others to be sort of drawn into those networks or to start conversations. And people were generally very responsive, so they might post a picture and then they'd have a back and forth of 20 or 30 or 100 comments under those pictures, with often people kind of asking questions about how they got there or what they were up to, and that sort of acting as a bit of a funnel, I think, towards the more formal recruitment that we saw going on. As I said, Facebook was sort of the main platform, and particularly individuals, sort of prominent individuals and Facebook pages of groups and units. But we did also find presence on Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and a few other platforms as well. And the YPG seemed to be by far the most kind of proactive in its outreach and recruitment to non-regional fighters. So the Lions of Rojava Facebook page, which you can see sort of the banner for there, and then their associated standalone website, was one of the biggest that we came across. When we wrote the report, it had 22,800 likes in 2016. I checked this last week, so not today, unfortunately, but it now is still up and has 53,600 likes. So it's over doubled in size over the last few years. What we found was that there was a sort of surface level where there was a boundary in terms of how much detail or how specific people were willing to go in their conversations. And then we sort of tended to see it dip down into private messages, either on Facebook or on more secure platforms as well. But again, at the time, people weren't sort of as careful about kind of privacy than maybe they would be now. And there were sort of anecdotal stories that essentially the process was very easy. You reached out to someone in one of these groups, they provided you with information, kind of support in terms of where to travel, what to bring. And actually the website even has its own sort of downloadable application form. and all sorts of resources to kind of provide to people and give them an understanding of what joining might involve. But I guess one thing worth stressing, especially with those quite big headline numbers, is obviously the vast majority of those kind of interacting with these pages weren't foreign fighters and were openly not pretending to be. They were just kind of people who were fans of what this group got up to. So another one for the Peshmerga, again, similar but considerably smaller, only 8,500 likes. But interestingly, this one was at the time verified by Facebook. So I can't tell you what the process at Facebook was for that, but they registered a London office address and Facebook seemed to think they were legit. So, you know, just to add a bit of credibility there. And sort of on this page, they claim to have provided safe route for 60+ international volunteers and also had an application form if you wanted to apply. Obviously, we can't kind of verify those numbers, but a fairly kind of transparent attempt at recruitment. So in terms of roles and activities, again, I think there's some parallels with those that traveled to Ukraine. I think a lot of them were not as involved in combat as they would have liked to be, or, you know, pretended to be more involved than they perhaps were, either kind of, you know, on an individual level because that's what they were sort of motivated by, or I think in other cases there were plenty of examples of them complaining that they were given kind of low-level menial tasks and weren't really as involved in the action as they would have liked to be. And just a quote here at the bottom from a Peshmerga colonel, essentially just saying that they're a bit of an unknown entity. I think obviously those with military experience, I think, were sort of used in a more combat role, but as the majority of them didn't have military experience, I think those tended to be the ones that were put in charge of you know, social media and cooking and other tasks. Actually, one interesting kind of difference, although we didn't find that many women, was that those we did find were actively involved in combat. And I think that's a sort of feature of the YPJ that's fairly unique, really, that they do kind of openly encourage women to join as combatants. We did also find that there were a few kind of smaller independent units that weren't sort of directly affiliated to the YPJ or the YPG or the Peshmerga or one of the bigger, more established groups, but seemed to kind of flit around and fight with whoever was kind of aligned with them at the time or in the right place. And so there was a German biker gang that had sort of Armenian connections and some other sort of slightly odd and different groups out there. We did also find evidence of people switching groups when they were frustrated, but I'm not sure it necessarily kind of solved the problem from their point of view. And this also often created kind of tensions between locals and anti-ISIS foreign fighters who, you know, essentially didn't feel like they were treated particularly well by kind of the local fighters. And that's it for me. Thanks.